Earth refused to join the war, until aliens picked the wrong enemy part. The morning sun rose over Geneva as Kyle Morrison stepped into the United Nations Assembly Hall. He had been Earth's chief diplomat for 5 years, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this moment. The year was 2287, and humanity was about to meet representatives from 6 different alien civilizations. Kyle adjusted his collar and walked toward the center of the massive chamber, where world leaders had gathered from every corner of Earth. The room fell silent as holographic projectors hummed to life. 6 figures materialized before them, each one more bizarre than the last. The tallest among them stood nearly 3 meters high with an insect-like body, covered in dark blue armor. Its compound eyes reflected the lights of the chamber as it surveyed the assembled humans. The creature stepped forward and spoke through a translation device that rendered its clicking sounds into perfect English. Its name was Thexlar, and it served as the primary spokesman for something called the Galactic Council. Kyle listened carefully as Thexlar explained the situation. The galaxy was at war, and it had been for over 3 centuries. An empire called the Krovar Dominion had been consuming worlds and enslaving populations since before humans had even invented the steam engine. The Council represented the free civilizations fighting against this threat, but they were losing. Thexlar's words carried a weight that made every person in the room feel the gravity of what was being asked. The Council needed soldiers, ships, and fresh military tactics. In exchange, they offered technology that would advance human civilization by centuries, and a permanent seat among the galactic powers. President Marcus Webb sat in the front row, his face carefully neutral as he processed the information. Next to him, General Linda Hayes reviewed data streams on her tablet, analyzing casualty reports and strategic assessments the Council had provided. The numbers were staggering beyond comprehension. Trillions of beings had died in this war. Entire star systems had been sterilized of life. The Council's fleets, despite their superior technology, were being pushed back system by system. Kyle could see the desperation in Thexlar's body language, even across the barrier of alien biology. The Council had traveled for months to reach Earth specifically because they needed something different, something their traditional allies could not provide. The presentation continued for 2 hours as other Council members described the Krovar threat in detail. The Dominion believed in absolute conquest. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners except as slaves. Every world they captured was stripped of resources and incorporated into their ever-expanding empire. The Council had managed to slow them down, but stopping them seemed impossible without significant reinforcement. Humanity, as the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel, represented a fresh pool of warriors untainted by centuries of defeat and desperation. The Council's military strategists believed that human unpredictability might be exactly what was needed to turn the tide. When the presentation ended, President Webb requested a recess. The alien delegates faded from view as their holograms deactivated. Kyle immediately joined a secure conference with Webb, General Hayes, and the representatives from Earth's unified parliament. The debate that followed was intense but surprisingly brief. Humanity had spent the last 2 centuries rebuilding from its own catastrophic wars. The resource wars of the early 21st century had killed over 1 billion people. The climate catastrophe that followed had nearly destroyed modern civilization. It took 150 years of dedicated effort to heal those wounds and create a truly unified Earth government. Every person in that conference room carried the historical memory of what war had cost humanity. General Hayes presented the military assessment first. Earth's defense forces were designed to protect the home system and its 12 colony worlds. They had never been intended for offensive operations light years away from support. Training soldiers to fight in an alien war against an enemy humanity knew nothing about would take years. The casualties would be immense, and there was no guarantee that human involvement would change the outcome. Hayes concluded her report with a simple recommendation: Earth should remain neutral. President Webb polled the parliamentary representatives next. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would not send its children to die in someone else's war. Kyle returned to the assembly hall where the Council delegates had rematerialized. The room was packed with journalists and observers from around the world, all waiting to hear Earth's decision. President Webb took the podium and delivered his response with quiet dignity. He expressed sympathy for the Council's plight and acknowledged the horror of what they faced. Earth would open its borders to refugees from the war. Humanitarian aid would be provided to displaced populations. Medical supplies, food, and shelter would be offered to any who needed it. But Earth would not contribute soldiers or military vessels to the conflict. Humanity had learned too well the cost of war, and they would not willingly embrace it again. The silence that followed was profound. Texler's compound eyes seemed to darken as he processed the refusal. No species had ever turned down the Council's request before. The benefits offered were too significant and the threat too serious for any rational civilization to remain neutral. Texler leaned forward, his translation device conveying a tone of warning. He explained that neutrality might not be possible in a galaxy at war. The Krovar did not respect neutral parties. They would not honor Earth's desire to remain uninvolved. Sooner or later, humanity would be drawn into the conflict whether they wished it or not. Kyle Morrison stood and responded on behalf of Earth's government. He acknowledged the warning but reaffirmed the decision. Earth's borders would be defended, but Earth would not go looking for war. If the Krovar threatened human space, humanity would respond, but until that moment arrived, Earth would maintain its neutral stance. The Council could accept these terms or seek their warriors elsewhere. Texler consulted briefly with his fellow delegates before responding. The Council accepted Earth's decision with disappointment. They hoped humanity would reconsider as the war continued to spread. With that, the first contact with the Galactic Council ended. The holographic projections faded, leaving the assembly hall filled with confused and concerned human observers. President Webb addressed the world that evening, in a broadcast that reached every corner of Earth and all 12 colonies. He explained the decision and the reasoning behind it. Humanity had not sought isolation, but neither would they abandon the principles that had allowed them to survive their own worst impulses. Earth would remain a beacon of peace in a galaxy consumed by war. The colonies would continue to grow. Trade and exploration would proceed as planned. Life would go on as it had before first contact. General Hayes activated Earth's defense protocols that same night. Border patrols were increased. Sensor networks were expanded. Military readiness was elevated to a precautionary status. If the Krovar came looking for trouble, Earth would be prepared, but they would not go looking for it themselves. 6 months passed in relative quiet as humanity returned to its routines, and the galaxy continued its war. Earth refused to join the war, until aliens picked the wrong enemy part. The colony of New Portland had been thriving for 7 years on a planet orbiting Tau Ceti. Janet Pierce had served as the colony administrator for 3 of those years, and she loved every moment of it. The planet was perfect for farming with rich soil and a stable climate that reminded everyone of Earth's countryside before the industrial age. 340,000 people called New Portland home, most of them families who had left Earth's crowded cities to build something peaceful and simple. Janet started every morning by reviewing the harvest reports from the agricultural zones that spread across 2 continents. Today was no different as she sat in her office watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The sensors detected incoming ships at 7 minutes past dawn. Janet pulled up the orbital display expecting to see a trade vessel, or perhaps another group of refugees from the Galactic War. Earth had welcomed over 15,000 displaced aliens in the past 6 months, and New Portland had taken in nearly 2,000 of them. The refugees worked alongside human colonists in the fields and factories, grateful for a chance to live in peace far from the fighting. Janet smiled as she prepared to authorize another landing clearance. Then the sensor officer called her with urgency in his voice. The ships were not broadcasting any identification codes. There were 12 of them, all military class, and they were taking up attack positions. Janet's smile disappeared as she activated the colony-wide alert system. New Portland had minimal defenses because it was a farming colony in neutral space, protected by Earth's declaration that humanity would not participate in the war. Surely that protection meant something. The communications officer tried hailing the unknown ships repeatedly, but received no response. Janet ordered an emergency message sent to Earth, while simultaneously activating the evacuation protocols that had been drilled but never used. Parents grabbed their children from schools. Workers abandoned their posts. Everyone ran for the designated shelters built deep underground. The ships dropped their cloaking fields, revealing hulls covered in weapons and armor. They were Krovar warships. Commander Vex Thor stood on the bridge of his flagship watching New Portland rotate peacefully below. His orders were clear and came directly from the Dominion's high command. Intelligence reports suggested that Earth was secretly developing weapons for the Council, despite their public neutrality claim. New Portland would serve as an example to discourage other neutral parties from hidden involvement. The fact that the intelligence was completely wrong did not matter to Vex Thor. He had his orders, and the Crovar did not question commands from above. He gave the signal to begin orbital bombardment. The first strikes hit New Portland's 3 major cities within 90 seconds of each other. Buildings that had stood for years vanished in explosions that lit up the morning sky. Janet Pierce watched from her office window as the capital city disappeared in a flash of light and fire. The communications hub exploded. Before the evacuation message could be confirmed as received by Earth, Janet ran for the emergency bunker beneath the administration building as the ground shook from impacts. She made it halfway down the stairs before the building collapsed on top of her. Across the colony, similar scenes played out in every settlement. Crovar landing craft descended through the smoke carrying soldiers who had orders to eliminate survivors. They moved through the farming communities systematically, burning homes and destroying infrastructure. The refugees who had fled the war only to find peace on New Portland died alongside their human neighbors. Children hid in closets and basements while Crovar soldiers searched for them. Some families made it to the underground shelters and sealed the blast doors in time. Others were not so fortunate. The attack lasted 8 hours from first bombardment to final withdrawal. Commander Vex Thor reviewed the casualty estimates with satisfaction before ordering his fleet to depart. New Portland burned behind them as they entered hyperspace and vanished from the system. The automated emergency beacon that Janet Pierce had activated continued transmitting, long after she died under the rubble. It took 2 days for the message to reach Earth via the communication relay network. President Marcus Webb was in a budget meeting when General Linda Hayes burst into the room without knocking. She carried a data pad with trembling hands and her face was pale. Webb took one look at her expression and dismissed everyone else from the room. The footage from New Portland arrived via an automated probe that had escaped the system during the attack. Webb watched in silence as the recording showed everything. The orbital bombardment, the landing parties hunting civilians, Crovar soldiers executing unarmed farmers who tried to surrender, buildings burning while families screamed inside, children pulled from hiding places and killed in the streets. The recording lasted 47 minutes and Webb forced himself to watch every second of it. When it ended, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. General Hayes waited for orders, her jaw clenched tight with rage that she kept carefully controlled. Webb asked for the casualty count. Hayes reported that early estimates suggested fewer than 50,000 survivors out of 340,000 colonists. Most of the survivors were scattered in the wilderness or sealed in underground shelters with limited supplies. A rescue fleet was being assembled but would take 5 days to reach Tau Ceti. Webb asked if the Crovar were still in the system. Hayes confirmed they had departed 18 hours ago. Webb stood and walked to the window overlooking Geneva. Outside, people went about their daily lives unaware that everything had just changed. He turned back to Hayes and gave her authorization to mobilize Earth's military forces under Protocol Omega, a contingency plan that had existed since humanity first reached the stars. The message to the Crovar Dominion was prepared within the hour. It was broadcast on all known frequencies in every language the translation software could manage. The content was simple and direct. Earth demanded the return of all surviving colonists. The Crovar would withdraw from human space immediately. They would submit to justice for war crimes committed against civilians. The message was signed by President Webb and carried the seal of Earth's unified government. The response from the Crovar came 6 hours later. It was not a diplomatic reply. It was a recording of Commander Vex Thor laughing. The Dominion had fought the Council's best warriors for 300 years. They had crushed battle fleets that outnumbered them. They had conquered fortress worlds that were considered impregnable. What could one small species hiding in its corner of space possibly do? General Hayes stood in the Strategic Command Center surrounded by displays showing Earth's military assets. She had spent her entire career preparing for threats that might never come. Now the threat had arrived and proven itself more brutal than anyone had imagined. Around her, officers waited for orders. Ships were being recalled from patrol routes. Soldiers were being activated from reserve status. Factories were retooling to produce weapons. The machinery of war that humanity had hoped never to use again was grinding back to life. Hayes pulled up the files for Protocol Omega and began issuing commands. The Krovar wanted to know what humanity could do. They were about to receive a comprehensive education in human warfare. News of New Portland spread across Earth within hours of the official announcement. Protests erupted in major cities demanding action. Families of colonists gathered outside government buildings seeking information about their loved ones. The refugee aliens living on Earth watched with horror as the war they had fled followed them. President Webb addressed the world again, this time with no diplomatic softness in his words. Earth had tried to remain neutral. Earth had offered only peace. The Krovar had responded by slaughtering innocent civilians. That mistake would cost them everything. Earth refused to join the war, until aliens picked the wrong enemy part. 3 General Linda Hayes stood before a room filled with the best military minds humanity had to offer. Officers from every branch of Earth's defense forces had gathered in the command center beneath Geneva. The holographic display at the center of the room showed the Krovar territory spreading across dozens of star systems like a cancer. Hayes activated Protocol Omega with a command code that only 3 people on Earth were authorized to use. The protocol represented 200 years of accumulated knowledge about warfare, everything humanity had learned during its bloodiest century. Every battle, every strategy, every hard lesson purchased with millions of lives had been distilled into this document. The Galactic Council fought their wars with honor and established rules. They announced their targets in advance. They avoided harming civilians when possible. They engaged in fleet battles that looked like chess games between aristocrats. Humanity had stopped fighting that way after the first nuclear weapon was used in 1945. Captain Ryan Blake received his orders while his ship was docked at the Luna shipyards. The ECS Retribution was a stealth corvette, one of 50 identical vessels designed for a specific purpose. Unlike the Council's gleaming warships with their energy shields and plasma cannons, human vessels were built for asymmetric warfare. The Retribution carried no heavy weapons and no defensive shields. Instead, its cargo bay was filled with 600 autonomous mines, each one no larger than a briefcase. Blake assembled his crew of 20 specialists and departed Luna without any formal send-off. Their mission was classified at the highest level. They would infiltrate Krovar supply lines and plant their payload. The mines were sophisticated pieces of technology that humanity had developed without any alien assistance. Each mine had enough intelligence to wait for months if necessary, attaching itself to passing ships and stations while remaining completely dormant. The journey to Krovar space took 11 days, using the hyperspace routes that humanity had mapped over the past decade. Blake's ship moved silently through the void, its stealth systems making it nearly invisible to conventional sensors. The Krovar had sensors designed to detect Council vessels with their distinctive energy signatures. Human ships produced different signatures, and the Krovar systems were not calibrated to notice them. Blake identified a major supply route that connected 5 Krovar fortress worlds. Freighters moved along this route constantly, carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and replacement parts for the war machine. The Retribution released its mines in carefully calculated patterns across 3 days. Each mine drifted into position and waited. Some attached to freighters, others fixed themselves to orbital stations. A few even managed to attach to Krovar warships during refueling operations. The Krovar never noticed anything wrong. Meanwhile, Colonel Lisa Grant led a special operations team toward the Krovar frontier world of Zendros. The planet was a fortress that the Council had tried to capture 3 times over the past century. Each attempt had cost thousands of lives and achieved nothing. Grant had no intention of capturing the planet. She did not need to. Her team consisted of 40 operators, each one trained in infiltration and sabotage. They arrived at Zendros disguised as refugees using forged identity documents and makeup that altered their features. The Krovar were confident in their orbital defenses and never imagined that enemies could simply walk through their front door. Grant's team split into small groups and began mapping the planet's infrastructure over 2 weeks. They identified power plants, water treatment facilities, and communication hubs. They noted the schedules of guard patrols and the locations of automated defense systems. The operation began at midnight local time. Grant's teams moved simultaneously across the planet. Explosives were placed with surgical precision. Computer viruses were uploaded into control systems. Critical components were removed from machinery and replaced with faulty replicas. When Grant gave the signal, everything happened at once. Power plants failed across 3 continents. Water treatment centers shut down, leaving the capital city without clean water. Communication networks dissolved into static as relay stations stopped functioning. The Krovar garrison suddenly found itself blind, deaf, and powerless. They had over 50,000 soldiers on Zendros, but no way to coordinate them. The conquered populations that the Krovar ruled with brutal efficiency saw their opportunity. Uprisings began in a dozen cities as oppressed aliens turned on their occupiers. Grant's team was extracted by stealth shuttle 72 hours after the operation began. By the time the Krovar realized what had happened, the humans were already back in friendly space. Admiral Richard Cole commanded Earth's naval response from the ECS Defiant. He had no intention of engaging Krovar warships in direct combat. The Krovar had larger ships, better weapons, and 3 centuries of combat experience. Fighting them on their terms would be suicide. Instead, Cole targeted their logistics network. Fuel depots became priority targets. The Krovar used a specific type of refined plasma for their ships, and that plasma had to be stored in special facilities. Cole's strike teams hit 6 fuel depots in rapid succession using methods the Krovar had never encountered. Silent infiltration, timed explosives, complete destruction. Repair stations lost power at critical moments when Krovar ships were docked and vulnerable. Supply convoys entered hyperspace on schedule, but never arrived at their destinations, vanishing as if they had never existed. Dr. Helen Brooks worked in a civilian research facility far from the military operations. She was not a soldier and had never fired a weapon in her life, but she understood quantum physics better than almost anyone alive. When General Hayes brought her a problem, Brooks spent 6 weeks finding the solution. The Krovar used quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication across light years. This technology allowed their fleets to coordinate perfectly even when separated by vast distances. The Council had tried to crack the Krovar communication system for decades and failed. Brooks did not try to crack it. She made it useless instead. Her team designed specialized satellites that generated quantum noise, flooding the entanglement channels with meaningless data. The satellites were small enough to be deployed covertly and powerful enough to affect entire star systems. Within days of deployment, Krovar fleets found themselves unable to communicate. Their perfect coordination vanished, replaced by confusion and isolation. 6 weeks after New Portland burned, the Krovar Dominion had lost 16 outposts, 43 supply vessels, and 7 fortress worlds. Not a single human warship had engaged a Krovar vessel in direct combat. The mines that Captain Blake planted began activating according to their programming. Freighters exploded without warning. Orbital stations lost pressure and vented atmosphere into space. Warships docked for repairs suddenly found themselves crippled by internal explosions. The Krovar military command struggled to understand what was happening. Their sensors showed no enemy fleets. Their intelligence networks reported no major Council offensives. Yet their infrastructure was collapsing. Supplies stopped arriving. Communications became unreliable. Fortress worlds that had stood for centuries suddenly went dark. Supreme Commander Vaxral of the Krovar Dominion convened an emergency meeting of the War Council. He was old by Krovar standards, having led their military forces for 6 decades. He had personally commanded fleets in dozens of major battles and never lost. Now he stared at reports that made no tactical sense. His subordinates demanded immediate retaliation against humanity, but Vaxral was not so quick to respond. He pulled up every piece of intelligence the Dominion had on Earth and its history. What he found disturbed him greatly. Humanity had fought wars against themselves that made Krovar conflicts look restrained. They had built weapons capable of destroying their entire planet. They had developed strategies based on total warfare where nothing was sacred and everything was a valid target. The Council fought like warriors with honor codes. Humanity fought like cornered animals with nothing to lose. Vaxral proposed an immediate withdrawal from human space and diplomatic negotiations. His council members looked at him as if he had gone insane. The Krovar Dominion had never retreated in 300 years of war. They would not start now because of one minor species. The vote was unanimous against Vaxral's recommendation. Instead, the War Council mobilized the 7th Fleet under Admiral Drexnor. 300 warships would find Earth and reduce it to ash. That would teach the humans the price of interfering in Krovar affairs. Earth refused to join the war. until aliens picked the wrong enemy part. 4 Admiral Drexnor stood on the bridge of his flagship watching his fleet assemble in formation. 300 warships represented the largest military force the Krovar Dominion had deployed in 50 years. Each vessel was a masterpiece of military engineering, with enough firepower to level a city from orbit. Drexnor had been fighting the Council for 40 years, and earned his reputation through ruthless efficiency. When the War Council gave him orders to destroy Earth, he accepted without hesitation. The humans had embarrassed the Dominion by attacking supply lines and outposts like cowards. Now they would learn what happened when the Krovar brought their full military might against a target. The fleet entered hyperspace in perfect formation, bound for the Sol system where humanity had first emerged. The journey would take 3 weeks at maximum speed. Drexnor used that time to study everything the Dominion knew about Earth and its defenses. The reports were not impressive. Humanity had a small fleet of defensive vessels designed to protect their home system. They had no shields worth mentioning, and their weapons were primitive kinetic projectiles. Their colonies were lightly defended farming worlds with no military significance. By every logical measure, the 7th Fleet could sweep through human space in a matter of days. Yet Drexnor had survived 4 decades of war by never underestimating an opponent. He reviewed the reports of human sabotage operations with growing concern. The tactics were unlike anything the Council used. There was no honor in them, no respect for military tradition. The humans fought like predators hunting prey. On Earth, President Marcus Webb received intelligence reports from agents embedded throughout Krovar space. The 7th Fleet was coming, and its intentions were clear. General Linda Hayes estimated they had 3 weeks before the fleet arrived at Sol. Evacuating Earth was impossible with 8 billion people and nowhere near enough transport ships. Instead, Hayes activated the final phase of Protocol Omega. Every available resource was redirected to defensive preparations. The asteroid belt became a weapon. Mining operations that had spent decades extracting valuable minerals now focused on repositioning asteroids into strategic locations. Each space rock was fitted with positioning thrusters and packed with explosives. Orbital defense platforms designed for deflecting dangerous debris were repurposed as kinetic artillery. The Moon's industrial facilities shifted to weapons production at a pace that would have been impossible without automation. Captain Nicole Sanders commanded a converted freighter that had once carried grain between Earth and Mars. The ship was called Prosperity during its commercial days, and the name still appeared on its hull. Now the cargo bays held 40,000 tons of refined metal rods instead of grain. Sanders had been a merchant captain for 12 years before volunteering for military service after New Portland. Her crew consisted of former civilians like herself, people who had never expected to fight but would not stand aside when their species was threatened. They spent 2 weeks practicing their deployment procedures until every crew member could execute their role perfectly. The metal rods were simple weapons with no guidance systems or explosive warheads. They relied entirely on kinetic energy, the same principle humanity had used since the first human threw the first rock. Lieutenant Chris Parker led a squadron of fighter craft that looked primitive compared to Council designs. The fighters had no energy weapons and no faster-than-light capability. They carried chemical rockets for propulsion and nuclear-tipped missiles for armament. Parker had trained as an atmospheric fighter pilot before transferring to space operations. His squadron practiced maneuvers that would be considered suicide by traditional space combat standards. They used debris fields as cover. They executed roles and turns that made sense only to someone who had learned to fly in atmosphere, where 3-dimensional thinking was essential. The Council observers monitoring Earth's preparations sent warnings to the government. They had seen the Krovar 7th Fleet destroy entire civilizations. Surely Earth would consider negotiating a surrender to save some portion of their population. General Hayes sent back a single-word response that became famous throughout the galaxy. No. The Krovar would receive no surrender, no negotiation, and no mercy. When Admiral Drexnor's fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Sol system, they encountered something unexpected. Nothing. No defensive fleet waited to engage them. No orbital platforms were visible on their sensors. No communication came from Earth or any human vessel. The system appeared completely defenseless, as if humanity had simply abandoned their homeworld. Drexnor was immediately suspicious. He had read the reports about human tactics. They did not fight directly. They set traps and struck from unexpected angles. He ordered the fleet to advance slowly while maintaining maximum sensor coverage. The 300 warships moved toward Earth in a defensive formation designed to prevent ambush. The attack began in the asteroid belt. Hundreds of asteroids that Krovar sensors had cataloged as natural space debris suddenly activated their thrusters. They changed course and accelerated toward the fleet. Drexnor's point defense systems engaged immediately, destroying most of the asteroids before they could reach his ships, but not all of them. 17 warships suffered damage as multi-ton rocks impacted their hulls at velocities that overwhelmed their shields. The damage was not critical, but it slowed the advance and forced the fleet to spread out. Drexnor ordered his ships to blast every asteroid within range, turning the belt into a field of smaller fragments. What he did not notice were the small objects drifting among that debris. Captain Ryan Blake's mines had been positioned throughout the Sol system weeks earlier, waiting for exactly this moment. The mines activated simultaneously. Some targeted warships directly while others simply exploded to create clouds of shrapnel moving at tremendous speeds. The Krovar fleet suddenly found itself flying through a debris field of humanity's creation. More ships took damage. The neat formation collapsed as vessels maneuvered to avoid collisions. Admiral Drexnor realized he was exactly where the humans wanted him to be. He ordered an immediate combat spread, but it was too late. The orbital platforms around Earth activated. They were not energy weapons, but mass drivers that launched solid metal rods at a significant fraction of light speed. The Krovar shields had been designed to deflect energy weapons and particle beams. They struggled against simple kinetic projectiles that hit with the force of nuclear weapons. 3 warships were destroyed in the first volley. 6 more suffered critical damage. Lieutenant Parker's squadron launched from hidden bays on the moon's far side. The Krovar deployed their fighter screen to intercept, confident that their superior craft would make quick work of the primitive human vessels. Instead, they faced pilots who thought in 3 dimensions and used every piece of debris as tactical advantage. The human fighters swarmed and separated, never presenting a unified target. They fired missiles that split into multiple warheads mid-flight. They executed maneuvers that seemed random, but forced the Krovar fighters into positions where they blocked each other's firing solutions. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the Krovar had lost 40 fighters while the humans lost 9. Parker's squadron retreated to rearm, and fresh squadrons launched to take their place. Admiral Drexnor watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. His fleet was taking damage from every direction. Asteroids, mines, orbital platforms, and fighters attacked in a pattern that seemed designed to herd his ships into specific positions. He finally recognized the trap when Captain Sanders and the converted freighters appeared on his sensors. They had been hiding in Earth's shadow, their civilian hulls producing such minimal signatures that Krovar sensors had dismissed them as debris. Now they moved into position above the Krovar fleet and released their payloads. 40,000 tons of metal rods per ship spread across a 3-dimensional field. The Krovar fleet was flying directly into a storm of kinetic projectiles moving at orbital velocities. Shields collapsed under the sustained impacts. Warship hulls that had survived 3 centuries of conventional warfare were punctured by simple metal rods. The ships that survived 300 years were dying to weapons humanity had been using since before they reached their own moon. Earth refused to join the war. Until aliens picked the wrong enemy, Part 5 Admiral Drexnor gave the order to retreat with his fleet in ruins around him. Of the 300 warships that had entered Sol system with such confidence, only 73 remained functional enough to escape. The rest were destroyed or drifting hulks filled with dead crew. Drexnor himself would not survive the journey home. His flagship took a direct hit from an orbital mass driver during the final moments of the battle, and he died on the bridge still trying to understand how primitive humans had defeated his fleet. The surviving Krovar ships limped back to Dominion space, carrying a message that would change the galaxy forever. Humanity was not to be trifled with. The Battle of Sol became known throughout the Galactic Council within days. Ambassador Kyle Morrison received urgent communications from Thexlar requesting immediate consultation. The Council had watched the battle through long-range sensors and could barely believe what they witnessed. A species that had refused to join their war had successfully defended against the Krovar's elite fleet, using tactics and weapons the Council had never considered. Thexlar arrived at Earth with a full diplomatic delegation, hoping to convince humanity to reconsider their stance on neutrality. President Marcus Webb met with them in the same Geneva Assembly Hall, where first contact had occurred months earlier. His message was clear and unchanged. Earth had not sought this war. The Krovar had forced it upon them by attacking New Portland. Now that the immediate threat was addressed, humanity had no interest in joining the Council's broader conflict. Thexelar argued that human tactics could turn the tide of the entire war. Webb listened politely, and then explained something the Council had failed to understand. Humanity knew how to fight because they had spent centuries fighting themselves. They had learned every brutal lesson about warfare through their own blood and suffering. Those lessons had nearly destroyed their entire civilization. Earth had built its peace on the ashes of countless wars, and that peace was too precious to throw away for someone else's conflict. The Council could continue their war with the Krovar however they wished. Earth would defend its own territory and welcome refugees, but nothing more. Thexelar departed disappointed, but with a new respect for human determination. The war between the Council and the Krovar Dominion continued for 8 more months. During that time, Supreme Commander Vaxral finally received the authority he had requested months earlier. The Dominion's War Council had ignored his warnings about humanity, and the 7th Fleet's destruction proved him right. Now they listened when he proposed immediate negotiations with Earth. General Linda Hayes met with Vaxral on a neutral diplomatic station far from both Earth and Krovar space. The old Krovar commander was scarred from decades of combat, his dark carapace marked with the evidence of countless battles. He had survived longer than most of his species by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. Hayes presented the terms without any room for discussion. First, all surviving colonists from New Portland would be returned to human custody immediately. The Krovar would pay reparations to the families of every victim. Second, Krovar forces would withdraw from all human space and establish a demilitarized zone monitored by neutral parties. Third, the Krovar would face a tribunal for war crimes committed against civilians. The tribunal would not be run by humans but by the Council and other neutral species. Justice would be served according to galactic law. Fourth and most important, the Krovar would never again attack neutral parties. Their war was with the Council, and they would keep it that way. Vaxral listened to every term. By Krovar standards, accepting these conditions would be deeply humiliating. But he had read the reports from Sol System. He had seen the casualty figures. He knew what humanity was capable of when provoked, and he understood that provoking them further would be suicide. Vaxral agreed to every term without argument. The treaty was signed 6 weeks later with representatives from dozens of galactic civilizations as witnesses. The surviving colonists from New Portland, fewer than 48,000 people, returned to human space. Many chose never to return to the colony itself. The memories too painful. Those who did go back found a world slowly healing. The memorial built on New Portland listed 292,000 names of those who had died. It became the most visited site on the planet, a reminder of the price of peace and the cost of war. President Webb attended the dedication ceremony along with General Hayes, Admiral Richard Cole, Captain Ryan Blake, Captain Nicole Sanders, and Lieutenant Chris Parker. Hundreds of others who had served during the 8-month war stood silently as the names were read. Webb's speech was brief and carefully considered. He reminded everyone why Earth had refused to join the Galactic War in the first place. Humanity had learned the cost of conflict through bitter experience. They had built a peaceful civilization from the ruins of their own destructive past. The Krovar had forced them to remember skills they had hoped never to use again. But remembering those skills did not mean embracing them permanently. Earth would return to its peaceful expansion among the stars. They would continue welcoming refugees and building colonies. However, the galaxy had learned an important lesson, and so had humanity. Peaceful did not mean defenseless. Earth would maintain its military readiness. Every ship would carry weapons. Every colony would have defenses. Every citizen would know the history of New Portland and understand why vigilance was necessary. The Galactic Council's war with the Krovar Dominion continued for another decade before exhaustion forced both sides to negotiate a lasting peace. Neither side achieved total victory. Both were diminished by the long conflict. Historians analyzing the war's turning point consistently noted that it came not when the Council gained new allies, but when a neutral party demonstrated that attacking the uninvolved carried severe consequences. The Krovar never again struck at neutral worlds. The lesson was simply too expensive to learn twice. Earth's reputation spread throughout the galaxy. They were known as a peaceful species that preferred diplomacy and trade. They were also known as a species that had fought itself to the edge of extinction and learned every possible lesson about warfare from that experience. A young Crovar historian named Thelrix published a study on the 8-month war 20 years after it ended. His conclusion became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. He wrote that humanity had taught the Crovar something they should have already known. Every species has warriors and every civilization has soldiers. But only a fool attacks those who have learned to live without war because they alone truly understand its cost and will pay any price to end it. The study was translated into 40 languages and discussed in strategic planning sessions throughout Council space. Ambassador Morrison, still serving as Earth's representative to the galactic community, was occasionally asked why humanity continued refusing Council membership. His answer never changed. Earth had joined the galaxy to find peace, not more wars. If war found them again, they would be ready, but they would never go looking for it. In the decades that followed, Earth's borders were respected by all parties. The galaxy learned to appreciate human culture, technology, and diplomatic skill. Trade flourished between human space and dozens of other civilizations. But every species that dealt with humanity remembered New Portland and the Battle of Sol. They remembered what happened when someone picked the wrong enemy. Humanity, for its part, hoped never to be provoked again. The weapons remained ready. The defenses stayed active. The soldiers trained and the fleets patrolled. But Earth's primary focus returned to exploration, art, science, and the quiet work of building a better civilization. The memorial on New Portland remained, its message simple but profound. Here stood those who wished only peace, and in their memory humanity remained vigilant.